Hi, I'm Tara Lynne of Geek Saga Entertainment, and thanks for joining me for the Geek Saga Show. I am extremely excited for this episode as it features a very special guest for an interview on two things near and dear to both of our hearts: history and Red Dead Redemption. Um, my guest, Tori Olson, isn't just a huge fan of the game. He's a professor at the University of Tennessee, where beginning in 2021, he taught the course Red Dead America, the real history behind the hit video game, an experience that he used as basis for his upcoming book, Red Dead History, a video game, an obsession, and America's violent past. The book, which will be officially released on August 7th, even features an audiobook version narrated by Roger Clark, the actor who played none other than Arthur Morgan in Red Dead Redemption 2. And I was lucky enough to snag an early copy myself. You can sort of see it behind me at SDCC last weekend, which I devoured in about 3 days. So, Tori, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Yeah, thank you so much, Tara, for inviting me to join for that introduction. Thanks so much for anyone who's tuning in to listen to us. It is a real pleasure to be here. Like Tara mentioned, my name is Tori Olson, and I am both a historian and a major fan of the Red Dead Redemption games. But, being a historian makes that a very different kind of fandom, to be sure. So I am my technical title is that I'm an associate professor of history at the University of Tennessee in Eastern Tennessee in the Southern Mountains in Knoxville, Tennessee. And I earned a PhD in history, was a history major. Tara and I have this in common. We established this
Mhm.
very early on after we met. We have many, many commonalities, not just the fact that our names are four letters and begin with a T.
And have an R in the middle too. Like
That's true. There's a great deal of similarity here. Yeah, so I'm the author of this new book, Red Dead's History, which is coming out in just a few days, and really eager to talk about the surprising ways that video games, and even violent video games, can actually serve as a gateway to learning big things, especially to delving with the intricacies of American history, which is, of course, the setting of the Red Dead Redemption games, this kind of turn of the century, late 19th, early 20th century moment. So thrilled to be here.
Yeah, well, as I mentioned, I'm Tara. You can find me at a Geek Saga on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, Threads, and Twitter. Additionally, just want to mention the Geek Saga Entertainment Patreon. We have 10 tiers ranging from $1 a month to $40 a month. It's a great way to support us and receive some fun perks in return, including early access to the podcast version of this episode and early access to my other podcast only series, including Hot D Takes, which is on HBO's House of the Dragon, and my solo podcast series, Impulsive Hyperfocus. You can find my Patreon at patreon.com/geeksaga_entertainment. Now, sorry, it's very dry here. Now, I'm going to try to keep this interview as organized as possible, but it's also meant to be a fun discussion. So bear with us as we kick it off with some of Tori's thoughts on playing Red Dead, followed by his experiences teaching his course at the University of Tennessee, and then his thoughts on writing Red Dead's history. So let's get into it. Just starting with gameplay, do you think, as a professor of history and history lover, that you felt more of a connection to the Red Dead games than to other games you've played?
Well, so I play games primarily on Steam, and Steam very visibly tallies the hours that you've spent in games. And it is very true that I have played Red Dead Redemption 2 more than any other game that I own. That's not all that surprising, given that I've devoted like 3.5 years of my life to it
Yeah, no
in many
kidding.
ways, right? So I have a very special connection with Red Dead 2. I'll confess, I have not played Red Dead 1. I have watched it. I've watched several playthroughs on YouTube. It doesn't quite give you the same immersion, obviously, as playing a game three times all the way through as I have with Red Dead 2. But I do have a very special connection with them. So to understand my connection with video games, just a quick bit of personal history here.
Yeah, yeah.
I was a huge gamer in high school, like in middle school and high school. That was a while ago. That was in the late 1990s. And in that era, I was a huge PC gamer. I played a lot of Half-Life, Doom, Quake, Warcraft. Wolfenstein, all the classics from that period. But between the years 2000 and 2020, I really didn't play any video games at all. Okay, so I took like when I started college, I basically quit video gaming cold turkey. It was not doing me any favors academically, and I decided
Mm,
get serious about life, right? And I kept up that pledge for 20 years. Went to graduate school, earned a PhD, became a junior professor, and didn't play hardly anything at all. But then, of course, comes the pandemic in 2020, and so basically for the last 4 years, I've been playing video games again. And Red Dead 2 was one of the very first games that I picked up. Um, is it my favorite game that I've ever played? I mean, it's like in a separate category, because it's not just leisure and recreation,
right.
professional, engagement. It's work, it's writing, it's teaching. But that makes me love it all the more, nevertheless.
Yeah, I was gonna ask, even if this obviously you had this special connection with this game, but what are a couple of other games that you've loved? Just, off the cuff.
Yeah, don't get me started because we'll spend the whole interview talking about that, and that's
That's why
certainly not the point. So the very first game that I played in like starting in March of 2020, like as soon as the pandemic started, lockdowns began, was another big, complicated storytelling open world game. Not so historical though. It was The Witcher 3. And The Witcher 3 is
mm,
like really what got me back into video games because I was like absolutely floored by what was possible in a video game. Keep in mind that like the last game I played before Witcher 3 was like Deus Ex from 1999, which is like an amazing video game, but very, very juvenile and unsophisticated compared to The Witcher 3.
mhm.
I think my favorite games that I've played in the last 4 years, like since I've kind of reconnected with my gamerdom, is I like Cyberpunk 2077 too, which, because I love Witcher 3, so I went for that one. I'm currently playing and so obsessed with Elden Ring, which
Yep.
is dangerous. It's kind of hard. Um, what else have I loved? I love Disco Elysium. I played that earlier this spring. It was just beautiful, so funny and hilarious and smart.
I haven't heard of
There's
that
a lot of
one.
games that I've loved.
Yeah.
Yeah, but those are kind of the tops. All very different, of course.
Yeah, I mean, the Red Dead series is definitely just my all-time favorite period, but I've played a little bit or a lot of quite a few other games, not so much recently because I haven't had time, but but also, um, I you mentioned that you haven't played Red Dead 1, and to be fair, I will say that until the remastered, quote, unquote, "version" came out last year, it really was
Ported.
not widely available. You had to have the PlayStation, like, online network.
I didn't have the hardware. I would have played
Yeah.
it, but I had to like track down a PS3. Like, no.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly,
I'm a
'cause
latecomer to the party. Like, I didn't play any Red Dead games until 2020. I've
mhm,
made up for lost time, obviously, right? I've spent a lot of time investigating them and thinking about them since then. But there's people who have like 15 years of experience who start with Red Dead Revolver and then went with John Marston and Red Dead Redemption, the original, and then it was kind of old hat in 2018 when Red Dead 2 came out. I'm not
mhm.
that person, but I like to think again that I've made up for lost time and I'm still pretty savvy about the games and of course the larger historical world that they kind of resurrect or
Yeah.
recreate or try to recreate.
Well, listen, no gatekeeping here, honestly, like, I was actually trying to say it was unless you played Red Dead the first Red Dead years ago, it's been basically impossible to play it until they came out with that
Right.
quote, unquote, I keep saying that, "remastered" or whatever they called it,
I hear it's coming
version.
out for PC pretty soon, and
Yeah.
since PC is still my favored platform, I
Mhm.
will play it. I'll play it all the way through on that system. Yeah,
It's definitely worth it, even as just a comparison thing,
yeah.
honestly, so,
I have opinions on that game based on my
yes.
watching of playthroughs, and I do think it is. I might offend people here, but I think it is the inferior game to Red Dead 2. I really think everything that Red Dead 1 does well, Red Dead 2 does better. So, and my book, another spoiler alert here, my book is primarily, overwhelmingly about Red Dead Redemption 2. Really about the
Right,
storyline mode of Red Dead 2, not so much Red Dead Online,
right.
and not so much the first game, and definitely not Red Dead Revolver, unfortunately, which I actually
Yeah.
have not played.
I played very little of Red Dead Revolver, so it's a I'll mention that in a minute. But getting back to Red Dead, let's get the basics out of the way. Outside of the big three, because I can't give you an easy, super easy question to answer. So outside of the big three, Arthur, John, and Dutch, of course, who are your top three characters from the Red Dead games? Well, I guess from Red Dead 2, since it's the only one.
Yeah. Well, I'd say, I mean, so in my book, right, like Arthur probably gets the most space in terms of quotes and things like that, characters that I engage to as lenses to understand history. I have a very special relation with Arthur, obviously, right?
Mhm.
Roger is also who narrated the audiobook, so that's undeniable. But in terms of the big three, I'd say my top character that I'm most fascinated with as a historian and as a gamer is Charles Smith,
Mhm.
who's just opens such interesting windows in thinking about, race and indigeneity and uh, different perspectives on the West. And I was really, really thrilled that this past weekend in San Diego at Comic Con, I got to meet Nasheer Dalal, who plays
Mhm.
Charles Smith. I got to give him an autographed copy of the book, which was amazing. And I'm so eager to hear what he thinks of it because I do a lot with his character, with Charles
Mhm.
Smith in the game. So Charles gets a lot of quotation space in this book because he's a smart guy. He
Oh,
says
he's
really
great.
interesting things, and
Yeah.
he reflects, on his native history, native background, on his African American background, and yeah, he's just like always in the right place at the right time for saying something interesting about
Yeah.
stuff. Besides him, I really like Javier Escuela
Mm.
too. Given that, so I'm partially a historian of Mexico as well. My first
Oh,
book
wow,
was
okay.
really about Mexico and the Mexican Revolution, and this was my favorite part of Red Dead One. Was it's the place of Mexico and the Revolution in 1911. So Javier is like an interesting character as well because he's an outlaw and he's a bandit, but he's an immigrant and he's this guy who's kind of different than some of the camp members. I mean, I think he's the only Spanish-speaking member of the camp, if I'm not wrong. But yeah, he's just a fascinating character. And then let's see, I'll add one more. Tilly Jackson. Tilly Jackson is so cool, and a lot of this is like my love. I'd always loved Tilly, but then I met Mia Davis, who plays her
Mhm.
at Deadwood at the convention recently, and I just thought she was so amazing and so funny
Mhm.
and brilliant that I was like, well, Tilly's even cooler now than she was before.
Yeah, no, for real, yeah, she's the sweetest, honestly.
Yeah.
Um, all right, well, next up, what area of the map is your favorite to play in and or explore, and why?
Yeah, well, that has a very easy answer for me because there's one area of the map that really convinced me to teach the class and to write the book, and that is the state of Lemoyne, the
Mm.
southeastern, state that has Saint Denis within it. We haven't talked about this before, but when I picked up Red Dead 2 in early 2020 during the pandemic, I didn't do so for like professional reasons. I did so for fun. Like
Mhm.
I heard the game had great graphics. I heard it had a very HBO-like storyline. Both of those things are totally correct, right? It was a brilliantly
Yep.
written game, and the graphics are insane, even 5 years after release, to be sure. So I picked it up for fun, and my primary training as a historian, the field that I really kind of specialize in, is Southern history. I live in the South. I did my PhD in the South at the University of Georgia. My first book was half Mexico and half about the US South. So, like, I've read a lot of Western history. I've read a lot more in the last 4 years, to be sure, as I've done this project. But Western history was kind of like a side field for me. So when I pick up the game and start playing, I'm like, everyone says it's a Western too, right? I just imagined the whole
Yeah.
game would be set in the West. I was surprised quite soon that that was not the case. But it's about like 15 to 20 hours into the storyline when the gang is forced to flee their camp in whatever it's West Elizabeth or New Hanover, the kind of western portions of the map.
Mhm.
And once you move into Lemoyne, it was like when I walked into the town of Rhodes and saw the way that it portrayed like the plantation South in the 1890s, that's when a switch flipped inside of my head. And I thought, wait, I could do a class about this. Like, this is not just Western history. This is also Southern history.
Yeah.
And that was the real moment. And then it moved into Appalachia, the Southern Mountains. And that's another place I know a great deal about. So that was when things clicked. And so, a lot of my class and a lot of the book is about, it's a balance of, yes, the West, but then the South and
Mhm.
Appalachia, and in my class, the Caribbean and Mexico during the Mexican Revolution. So yeah, Lemoyne is my favorite. It's just so interesting. It's so well. I mean, all parts of the map are beautiful and have their amazing, storylines and missions and all that. But Lemoyne is special to me. Saint Denis is special to me.
Oh,
Like
I
every
feel
time
I
I
feel that
scroll,
especially. This yeah,
yeah.
Saint Denis is very special to me for a lot of reasons,
Even,
so I
I
get it.
played the game for 200 hours, which I know there's many people out there who played far more than that, but for me, that's a lot of hours. Even after 200 hours, like when I walk into Lemoyne, I mean, Saint Denis still, I feel like a little shiver down my spine when I see the smokestacks belching black smoke into the sky, like the cotton piled up on the docks. That's, it's a beautifully depiction of a city at that
Mhm.
moment in time. So to me, it's one of the best rock star cities of all time, and it's not the first. There's been several before.
Yeah, I think my first playthrough alone, I put in at least 170 hours.
Oh,
I did not get 100% completion. I got something like 87 or 89%. But yeah, it was a lot of time. Okay. So following up on that, I have to ask, and this is in the gameplay and plot sense only, how do you feel about Guarma? Having to go there, what happens there, how short of a time is spent there, stuff like that.
yeah. I know from reading blogs online and gaming websites and things like that that a lot of people don't like Guarma. That I think it's kind of sticks out like a sore thumb. It's so different and it's kind of this brief interlude. I really like it. I think it provides. I mean, I like it as a gamer and as a historian, right?
Mhm.
I like it as a gamer because it's cool. Like it's a totally different biome, if you will. There's some
Mhm.
interesting missions. You got to recover your gear. Your gang mates are all kind of dispersed. But as a historian, I love it because it helps broach this major question, which is American imperialism, right? So this game is set in 1899. Well, in 1898, the U.S. invades Cuba, Puerto Rico, the Philippines, Hawaii. Like it's this massive moment of kind of imperial expansion,
Yeah.
which the game, in the Guarma chapters gets at a little bit. But one of the great sort of tragedies in many ways of the book is that I actually don't do anything with Guarma in the book.
Right.
I
Yeah.
wish I had the space to do so. In a perfect world, I would have devoted like 3 or 4 chapters on Guarma and about kind of American expansionism in the 1898, 1899 moment. But I like Guarma. Yeah, I think it's cool. I think the game would be weaker without it.
Yeah, see, I only wanted to ask, not obviously, I know having read now that you didn't really touch on it at all, but I wanted to ask because I am one of those people who the reason I don't like it is because I feel like it felt like it was an unfinished part of the game, like, they just because you spend so little time there, you can drag it out as much as you want, but you still spend so little time there. So that's like why I don't like it. Not because I feel like it was necessarily a bad decision to have the characters go there.
Yeah.
And I do think there is some meaning for sure behind that, especially in the time frame that the game is set in. But yeah,
Even
it
even
just
if
felt too short.
but let's say you spend 10 hours there, that's probably what I spent my first playthrough. You get new perspective on the mainland map. Like everything kind
Mm.
of looks a little different. You're like really happy to be back in many ways. So like to
Yes,
me
for sure.
it kind of gave new sparkle to old destinations that I'd been, treading over before.
Yeah. Okay. Last but not least, before we get into our next section, what are your favorite and least favorite encounters and things to do in the game? And I'm thinking of like in terms of encounters, like running into Nigel on his search for Gavin or helping the suffragettes, things you don't have to do, but you can do. And then in terms of just general things to do, hunting and or fishing, playing cards or dominoes or five finger fillet,
Yeah.
just hanging out in camp and wandering around, listening over like ear, dropping eaves into people's conversations and whatnot.
That I love, right?
Yeah.
Like the kind of slow moments in camp, those are some of my favorite, episodes in the game. That's when you catch the sort of depth of what the writers and developers of this game wanted, especially regarding history, right? So like I love
Hmm.
the moment when you catch Uncle in camp. I don't know if you saw this, Tara, but like he's reading a newspaper and he's like, what are we doing in the Philippines? Like, why are we fighting a war in
Yeah.
the Philippines? So that's a great moment. It's brief, but it's, shows the kind of global awareness of what's going
Hmm.
on, or like Lenny talking about his enslaved father and about the experiences of slavery by 1899 and the sort of memories of this stuff. Like that's brilliant. There's really great
Hmm.
moments in there. I never gambled. Literally, I've never spent a single minute gambling.
I think I only there might be one time where you're forced to do it if you get into or there no, probably more than one time where you're forced to do it if you get into certain side missions, but unless I was forced to do it, I did not choose to.
I did not play Gwent in Witcher 3, and I did not play poker in Red Dead Redemption 2.
Or
It's just,
dominoes or five-finger
yeah,
fillet.
it's
I
just,
don't understand why people like playing five-finger fillet.
I'm not a gambler. I've actually,
Yeah,
it's
I'm not
funny,
either.
like, I met you in Deadwood, South Dakota, and there's gambling everywhere. Did I partake? No, I'm not really a gambler.
I've aged out of it a little bit now, and I'm not saying I'm old, I'm just saying I'm at this point in my life where it's not the place I wanna go, but I've been to Vegas like 2 dozen times, and I am not at all a gambler, so but the difference is there's a ton of other food and dancing and drinking and all that stuff,
Right.
sightseeing to do in Vegas, but yeah, no, I agree. Okay, well, what about encounters before we move on? Any specific, like, just not necessarily side missions, but just things you kind of happen to run into and
Yeah.
get involved in?
Yeah. So, I mean, my book and my class draw upon so many different moments in the game to kind of explore the sort of real history that the game sort of gestures toward. And some of the moments are kind of like main storyline mission moments, but then some of them are these kind of passing encounters. And I think there's one small encounter that provides actually the foundation of a whole chapter in here, which is the encounter that you have in Rhodes with this African American doctor named
Mhm.
Dr. Renault, that you just kind of you happen upon, and he's had these kind of white good old boys steal his medicinal wagon, and he's explaining to Arthur what happened, and he mentions that these guys had like threatened to do these horrible punishments to him, to like crucify him and do all this sort of thing. And as far as I know, that is the closest reference the game makes to the institution of lynching, right? The sort of like
Yeah.
mass mob murder of primarily African American men in the South. It's not exclusively a Southern institution, but by 1899, it is overwhelmingly a Southern institution, and that is a reference that's really powerful to me because the 1890s was the worst decade of lynching in American history. Like the 1890s claimed more victims in that decade than any other decade in the U.S. In American history, in Southern history.
Yeah.
So I use that kind of 20-minute, 25-minute mission to thread out a much broader discussion of what was lynching, what were these, horrific, nightmarish threats that this black man who was competing with, white doctors,
Mhm.
or whatever, that he faced. So it provided me this amazing opportunity to kind of look at something that the developers were just tiptoeing around, and I understand why. Like it's an incredibly painful and very sensitive subject to talk about, but they made enough reference there that I was like, okay, well, let's talk about what this institution was actually like.
Yeah. Okay, well, since you've mentioned your class quite a few times, and obviously I, brought it up at the very beginning, so Tales from the Classroom. Um, In the preface of the book, Red Dead's History, you mentioned that your class announcement from Twitter made its way to Reddit, where it found a wide audience and garnered some strange comments. And as a regular Reddit user and a subreddit mod myself, let's just say I have plenty of experience with interesting Reddit posts and comments. So I have to ask, do you recall any of these comments in particular? Does anything like
Oh yes.
hopefully not terrible memories of them, but
No, no, no. It was fun. I mean, online comments are, well, behind the veil of anonymity, people
Mhm,
will really say things that they don't care what people think, or
mhm.
sometimes that they don't even believe. And let's be honest, some of these comments could actually be coming from like Russian bots that are trying to foment division in the United States. You never know what exactly is real or not.
Yeah.
But there was a pattern. Like the most negative comments. All right, so I posted this thing on Twitter, basically like, I'm doing a class on the real history portrayed in Red Dead Redemption 2. Here's some topics I'll cover. And then someone else, not me, put that tweet on Reddit, and
Oh, I know, I saw.
it was even more viral on Reddit than it was on Twitter, which was amazing. So I had not used Reddit before that time, but I got interested in it because of that.
Yeah.
The most common negative, strange comment were people who wanted to dump on college education in the United States. They
Ah,
wanted to talk about, wow, this is a perfect example of the uselessness of American colleges and universities because look at this professor, he's teaching a class about a fictional video game. They didn't get the part that, no, I'm not teaching the content of Red Dead 2 that is made up, right? There are no quizzes in my class about like who is a member of the Vanderlyn gang, right? What I'm doing in the class, and maybe I wasn't explicit enough in my tweet, what I'm doing is just using the fictional content of the games as a hook, as a lens to then explore the much bigger thing beyond it. And the plan back then, and what ended up happening, was really that the 90% of our time in the classroom was spent talking about real history, right? The classes all began with a hook from the game. I'll show clips from a mission, or sometimes briefly play the game in class with the students. But the point was not to learn about Micah Bell. The point was to learn about John D. Rockefeller and Ida B. Wells, and like
Mhm.
the major figures and actors and characters that shaped American history in that late 1800s moment. So yeah, a lot of people were just like, this is the perfect example of why I'm never going to college. However, they were definitely outbalanced like 5 to 1 by the people who were like, I'm applying to the University of Tennessee right now.
Listen, listen, if I could have, oh my God, I'm blanking on the term, but what is it called when you don't even go to the school, but you can like take that one course?
Auditing,
Auditing.
yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. I was like, I know it
Hmm.
starts with an A. Why am I blanking on this? Yeah, if I had known about this, because when I said, oh, I know, it's because I Googled after reading, the first part of the book, I Googled the Reddit, like I just Googled Red Dead's history or maybe I Googled University of Tennessee class, whatever, Reddit. And I saw there were a ton of posts about it. Actually, some of them were from you later, right? Like
Yeah,
after the book was being published and everything.
right.
You know what I mean? Like when you're in the process of getting the book published. But I think the first one had like 400 plus comments. Um
Yeah.
and I was like, I don't have
I've
time to
read I
read
read
through
like
these.
I read like a quarter of them, maybe even half
Yeah.
of them. It's soon enough you see patterns start to repeat, and you're like, okay, I kind of get
Okay, I'm
get the.
over
But
it.
no,
Yeah.
but the general reaction was enthusiasm.
Yeah.
Like, oh, I wish I had that when I was in college, or like how do I transfer to UT or whatever.
I
But I'll tell you,
mean,
Tara, it made those comments and all the kind of publicity that came from that early tweet was a huge part of why the class became a book.
oh,
Because like you said,
yeah,
I got
sure.
messaged by all these people who were like, how do I audit your class? Like
Mhm.
dozens and dozens of messages in my inbox. Like, how can I access? Is it on Zoom? Can I do, it's still pandemic times, right?
Yeah.
And I had to send the same disappointing message to every one of them, which is, sorry, you need to be enrolled at University of Tennessee, and you need
Yeah.
to be in person Tuesday and Thursday at 2:30 or whatever, and they can't do that when they're coming from Turkey or China
Yeah.
or France or whatever. But at the end of the class, right, when I'm sitting at the end of the semester, I've got this big stack of lectures, that I've worked my tail off to prepare. And
Mhm.
I got all those other messages in my inbox. I'm thinking, well, why not convert this class into a book? Why not repackage the sort of thinking and journey that I took my students on and make it accessible to a much wider audience? Like make this engaging, fast-paced, and meaningful to people both who love history in this period, but then people who love the game, right? The Red Dead heads, as I often call them, like the people who really, who've spent way more time than me playing the games and are really curious to use them as a vehicle for, understanding bigger things about the United States.
I'm over here like guilty. I will say, like, I could also picture the story of this game, particularly if you dive into a lot of little side stories being used in a literature class, just saying.
Oh yeah. I think there's a high school literature class that uses Red Dead 2 in some way, which is awesome.
Uh,
Using this game in the high school classroom is trickier, mainly because the game is rated 17 plus, so
mhm,
that does
mhm.
disqualify everyone but seniors basically for it.
Listen, I know what my 17-year-old stepkid watches on TikTok. They're
Oh, I
seeing
know.
way
I mean,
worse.
the high school kids are all playing it. We all know that.
Yeah.
But for like, for a teacher to defend it before the administration, before parents, it's dicier. I mean, for me, in as a university instructor, it's a lot easier because I don't field emails from angry parents. I have tremendous leeway and liberty in teaching what I want to teach, as long as it's meaningful and it's factually accurate. Uh,
Mhm.
so yeah, I'm liberated in ways that many high school teachers are. So I have a lot of respect for those high school teachers who are out
We're
there. They're not
trying, yeah.
teaching any history, but those who are thinking about using Red Dead in the classroom, because I think there's possibilities. I mean, I think I think this book could work in that context. It would just have to be in
Mhm.
the right setting to be sure.
Yeah. Okay, so we might get into this a little bit more in the next section when we dive more into the book itself, but as it was based on the class you taught, I'm assuming your class also covered most, if not all, of the plight of Black people in the South, not just slavery, but post Civil War lynchings, chain gangs, and the advent of Jim Crow. And as someone who lived in the South for nearly 2 decades myself, and seeing as you teach us at a school in the South, I'm curious as to whether you ever experienced pushback when delving into these topics. Like, I'm not even saying just from the administration, and I know there might be things that you can't say, or whatever, but students, who were kind of like, "Oh, this isn't what I expected. I didn't
Yeah.
expect to be learning about this specific thing and being told this specific thing that I don't want to hear."
Yeah.
King
No,
Cotton and all that.
that's a great question, right? So obviously, Southern history is a really crucial part of Red Dead Redemption 2's storyline,
Mhm.
right? Because it's in so much of it is in the South, and you cannot understand Southern history at any moment, but especially in the late 1800s, if you don't consider African American history, right? So I knew that that African American history in the South would be really crucial to this book and the class, of course. So it is a major part of it, but of course it's a major part of the game too, right? Like lots of your storyline missions are spent with Charles and with Tilly and with Lenny and other people. I mean, I think the single most, the single, if there's one single word that like sums up this game more than any other, it's Lenny. Right? Not that that itself is African American history, but black characters are really, really crucial to the storyline of the game. So I place them at front and center in the book.
Mhm.
They're not the only protagonists, right? That's certainly not true, but they're very, very important. So you asked, like, so I teach in the South. Obviously, I've been teaching in the South for 19 years at this point, right? First in Georgia and then in Tennessee. And I do delve into questions of regional history all the time. Do I get students, being like, wow, I'd never heard it taught that way? Yeah, all the time. You know, like I teach questions of the Civil War and slavery, right? And I think as just about every university history professor does, I place slavery at the very center of what caused the war and how to
Mhm.
understand its aftermath, right? The
Yeah.
emancipation of slavery is just a revolutionary consequence of the Civil War. So that's a story that a surprising number of Americans and Southerners in particular, but not just Southerners, had not grown up with, right? They'd grown up, no, this is the Civil War was caused by states' rights. It's like an ideological struggle about small government and all this sort of thing. And I mean, I can go into the depth of why that's wrong in so many ways.
But the
But yeah,
book
so I do
does
have,
it.
I have
The book does
students.
that a little bit, so I don't think you
Oh
have
yeah,
to.
yeah,
Gotta leave
absolutely.
some of it. No
That's
spoilers.
right. Yeah, don't want to spill all the beans. But I know I have students who are really kind of like, wow, this is a fundamentally different version of Southern history.
Mm.
So, let alone this, forget about the Civil War for a second, the 1890s, like that's a
Yes.
decade that very few people know about in Southern history. But it's actually like, I would say the third most important decade in Southern history. I would say the 1860s and the 1960s, right? Civil War
Mhm.
and civil rights are
Yeah.
probably the most two influential decades. But the 1890s, I would place as a third because there's so many things that happened during that decade. For example, right, I already mentioned that lynching kind of hits its bloody crescendo during those years. During the 1890s is when you see the Confederate battle flag being placed on state flags for the first time
Mhm.
ever. Had not been done previously. It's when you see monuments, like big public monuments, being constructed to the Confederacy. All those monuments that have been debated and many of them torn down in the last 5, 6 years, those were not built right after the Civil War. They're built during the 1890s. That's when it starts, and then continuing into the first 2 decades of the 20th century. So,
Mhm.
1890s is also the decade when Jim Crow laws, like segregation laws and disfranchisement laws, are first passed systematically in
Yeah.
the South. It's when Plessy versus Ferguson happens, the Supreme Court case that basically green lights racial segregation. So, like, all this stuff is happening in the 1890s. And Red Dead 2 somehow provides me this amazing opportunity to teach about it because even though the game doesn't place that stuff front and center, it gestures toward it many, many times in the game. So it allows
Yeah.
me an opportunity to kind of use that fictional content, to use characters like Lenny and Tilly and others to examine what that looks like. Like, why are there statues in the middle of roads in Saint Denis? What do those statues mean? Why did someone scratch coward on that statue in Saint
Mhm.
Denis. The game alludes to these things. Like on its own, the game is not going to teach you all the intricacies of the 1890s in the South, right? I mean, Red Dead 2 is not an edutainment title. It is an entertainment title.
Yeah.
But with a little bit of accompaniment, your
Mhm.
favorite game can actually be a window to learning things not just that are historical, but that really shape the world we live in today, right? The America of the 2020s, we really can't understand unless we understand that kind of late 1800s moment. So, sorry, I'm rambling.
No, you're not at all. You're
History
not at
professors can't
all.
help themselves.
No, you're not rambling at all. You were on topic. Rambling is I consider rambling being like just completely off into the West Wing over here. So this next question might be nonsensical and to the point where I might even actually cut it from the podcast if depending on the answer, but I don't want to get too I say I don't want to get too deep into the book just yet, which we already kind of have, but I will mention that its focus is almost entirely like 99.5%, at least on comparing RDR2 to history. However, I saw it noted a few places that your class did in fact include teachings on the first slash original Red Dead Redemption.
Yeah.
If that was the case, can you, I guess, briefly touch on a few of the things you taught surrounding the first main game? And yes, I know Red Dead Revolver is technically included in the Red Dead games and came first, but as we know, that's a different sort of game, so we're not going to get into it.
Right.
I'm
Yeah.
putting that in there for the people who are like, but Red Dead Revolver, and it's like, yes, I know it exists. I've played a little bit of it, but
Right.
it's not a full game like these are.
Yeah, for sure. No, let me address it because I do think that hardcore fans of the original Red Dead Redemption who maybe didn't like the second game might be a little peeved with my book that their favorite title didn't get quite the front row and center treatment, and I apologize to you. I'm sorry. This first game has strengths, to be sure. I think my real sort of criticism of that game would really turn me off to it more. I mean, obviously, like the graphics are a lot worse, but it's not fair to compare it, because it came out like
No.
12 years ago or something.
Yeah.
No, 14 years ago.
14.
Um,
Yeah.
so it's not, and I played the first game after the second game, so it's not entirely fair. But I think the real thing that sticks with me is that the only characters in the first game who really got nuance and complexity and like many different sides, they're all white men. And they're very interesting white male characters. John Marston, his cowboy buddy down in
Hey now, hey
Mexico.
now, hey now. Bonnie McFarlane is a white woman.
It's
Let's at
true,
least
but
give it that.
she's I don't know. Maybe she has more complexity than I grant her.
It could
But
depend on what playthroughs you watched, honestly.
it's true. Yeah, for sure. The game deserves more credit than I give it. And I'll say the one thing that it does really well that Red Dead Redemption 2 does not engage is the place of Mexico.
Mhm.
Because, when it comes to like Hollywood westerns, so many of them are actually northerns because they play out in northern Mexico, which is not the west, it's the north. And they take place, south of the border, as they say. And Red Dead 1, of course, pays homage to those Mexican outings of those Hollywood classics. But it's not just a Western or so like a Hollywood Mexican movie. It's a particular kind of setting because it's set in the Revolution, right? The Mexican Revolution, which begins in 1910 with the plot, the coup against Porfirio Diaz, this dictator who'd been in power for 30 some years at that time. It's so fascinating to me that they set Red Dead 1 at that moment, because the Mexican Revolution is this huge moment in global history. It's the first social revolution of the 20th century. And in that sense, it really sort of sets the stage for other major social revolutions of the 20th century. So, like, the Soviet Revolution just later in that same decade, the Chinese Revolution in the 1940s, the Cuban Revolution of the 1950s and 60s. So it's this major kind of like blockbuster moment in world history. And Red Dead 1 gets at some of the tensions within it, that you have
Yeah.
this sort of peasant uprising from below, challenging this local strongman who's, serving under this really dictatorial president. The game does a pretty decent job getting at some of the sort of dynamics of it. Does it essentialize it? Does it simplify it a whole lot? Yeah, of course it does. Does it portray the Mexican characters in a particularly good light? No, the Mexican
No.
characters really rub me the wrong way. I mean, they spoke decent Spanish, I can assert that. I do speak Spanish myself too. Their Spanish is okay, but their characters are such stereotypes, It's just like the angry cigar smoking, gringo hating bad guy. It's like, oh, really? Are we doing this again? So that's, given that that Rockstar remastered Red Dead 1 recently, I don't think they changed any of those characters. It's a little surprising to me because
No, they
they're
did
kind of
basically
offensive, they're
yeah.
not horrible, they're not the worst of the worst, but, like, they're really unpleasant. I don't think a lot of Mexican gamers would see those characters and like, "Yeah, that's
Yeah.
me," like, "Nah."
Well, and I mean, and Javier Escuela is
Javier is
also
better.
in the first Red Dead, and but also, like you said, he was one of your favorite characters in Red Dead 2, and, like, coming into Red Dead 2, having played Red Dead 1, I was kinda like, "Mm,
Yeah,
this
but
guy, I
he
don't
has
know."
substance, like,
Right, no, he
in
does,
the
for sure.
second game, he has nuance, right? Like, he's
Mhm.
not this flat guy who's, like, dictated by where he's from and, like,
Yeah.
that he's a man and that he's like, he has a you turn him one way and he looks a little different. So I think he's better. I mean, he's yeah,
Yeah, yeah, I mean, listen, none of them are good guys, let's be real.
right.
Um, well, okay, so
Charles Smith is kind of a good
yeah.
guy.
Yeah, he's probably the best of them all, let's be real.
Yeah,
Um, o on another note, I know but and this is the last question I have about, like, you teaching your class before we, like I have specific questions about your experiences writing the book, but, I know that Roger and Rob visited your class, and that must have been just an absolutely amazing experience for you and your students, so I definitely talk about that if you want to, but also, like, setting that aside, what is your other favorite memory or are your other favorite memories from teaching the class?
yeah. I'll share the class crashing day, and then I'll share my other favorite moment.
Yes.
Um, so class crashing day first was like literally one of the most hilarious, amazing, mind-blowing days of my entire life,
How
which
did
is
that come
pretty wild.
about, by the way, if you don't
Yeah, of
mind me
course. Yeah, yeah,
asking?
yeah. So, okay, so this past semester, spring of 2024, I taught Red Dead America for the third time. Right, so it was the third time I was doing it. By this point, I pretty much finished writing the book. So I knew much more about the class. I was it's probably the best version of it that I taught, in my opinion. So this class runs from January to May, right? The usual spring semester in the college year. But, by the time the semester started, I was already hooked in with Roger Clark. So it was November of last year that my publisher and I'm still just, like, thanking the heavens, the fact that they were able to pull this off, they secured Roger to be the narrator of the audiobook, right? And this was, like, a dream that I could never have imagined
Oh, it's
a
amazing.
year or 2 earlier, right? It just seemed so impossible, but somehow it happened, and I'm tremendously honored and delighted to be partnered with Roger on this. He's just an amazing guy.
Mhm.
Um, so, I was connected with him already. Like I had his email address. We've been swapping, swapping messages, and then at the very beginning of the semester, like in January, I saw on Facebook that Roger Clark and Rob Wiedoff, who plays John Marston in both the games, was coming to Knoxville already for a gaming convention for the Fanboy Expo. It was taking place right before spring break, right before we have spring break
Oh
here.
my god.
And I had this crazy idea pop into my head, right? Like I'm teaching this class. I have 75 students signed up. I already have a relationship with Roger. So I think like, well, let's try to get them to come to my class. But I didn't want to tell my students anything,
Oh,
you know?
no, absolutely not. No,
No, I wanted
the
it to be a
surprise
surprise.
aspect of it is the best part. Come
Exactly.
on.
So, I kept it totally hush hush, but I made an invitation to Roger and then through him to Rob to like they obviously knew about the class at this point.
Mhm.
Roger had read the whole book, I think, by this point, and asked them, hey, do you guys want to come and just like pop in unannounced to class? But the danger was that because this class session was right before spring break, the attendance tends to be rather low on
Mm.
those days, right? Students are like already
Yes.
down in Panama City Beach, drinking martinis or
Could
not
you have been
martinis,
could you have been like,
margaritas, right?
"Sorry, kids, you gotta come to my
No,
this this is
I can't tell
required."
them. I
Yeah, I
can't
know.
tell them who's coming, right?
No,
But
not that. I would've
I
I mean,
know.
I would've been that
Oh, no, so
bitch,
I
excuse
lied
my
to them.
language. Yeah, who is like,
Yeah,
"This is
I lied
required."
to them. I feel really bad about this. I lied to my students. I said, "You have to come this Thursday because there's gonna be a quiz. It's gonna be really important, right? It's gonna." I think I said it was gonna count double or something for their, you know, for their grade, and they're like, "Oh, you know, quiz." So, when the day came, you
Mean
know, I
big bad professor.
oh, in that card. I'm good at playing that card, by the way. Um, on the day of the class, you know, I basically had Roger and Rob like in my back pocket. I mean, they were in the hallway, they were waiting outside, and I came in. I told the students, you know, guys, good news. There's actually not a quiz, and they're like, "What the hell, man? You know, like, what are you doing?" And I said, instead, we're going to have two outside experts come join us and talk about gamifying the past. And I'm sure that they were thinking like, "Oh, you know, Olson's bringing in outside experts. It's probably some professor buddies of him." And then I tell them like, well, our two experts are Roger Clark, who played Arthur Morgan, and Rob Wiedoff, who played John Marston, and they just lost it, you know. So what you can actually watch this for yourself because we had a
I did see the video
yeah,
on Reddit. But like to be honest, I almost feel like it actually lend like the credence to like how
it
those
gets
kids
it.
reacted
I
because
know it
you
caught
see a
like a
few people
couple
go,
of drop jaws.
I know.
I'll tell you a story that's not captured on the video, which I wish had come through. Once when Roger walked in the no, before he walked in, when I said Roger Clark, who played Arthur Morgan, one student said, "Oh shit." Very visible, very audibly, you know. And what's funny is that the day afterward, he emailed me and he's like, Professor Olson, you know, I'm so sorry I said oh shit in class. You know, I know that's totally, you know, rude or something. And I'm laughing, of course, because I'm like, dude, that was amazing. That was exactly the response that I wanted. You know, like, what
Mhm,
do I expect you
mhm.
to sit there and just kind of like, you know, oh, whatever, this isn't cool? No, I want you to say, oh shit. So that guy is amazing for doing that. So he
Well,
always
and
full respect.
I will say this too, like Roger and Rob are so I mean, all of the actors are so just in tune with and amazing with their fans, right?
They really are. I don't think
They're
every game is like this or every
I
actor
don't
is like
know. I've been to a lot of conventions. I have moderated some really harsh panels where it was very clear that the person I
mhm,
was moderating for did not wanna be there. I don't get me wrong, it's those are the those are probably the minimum of panels I've moderated with actors, but, like,
right,
they do happen, and then there are the people who are there, and they're, like, interacting as much as they have to, and they're nice and everything, but, like, I feel like every especially having gone to Tombstone last year and being in Deadwood this year, every one of these actors is just so in tune. They are in love with the thing that they helped or that they were part of creating, and they love each other, and they are so, so appreciative and great with their fans, and it doesn't surprise me
yeah.
in the least that Roger and Rob were like, Yeah, we'll do it," you know?
Yeah. No, they were very as soon as they got the invitation, they're like, "Oh, yes, this is great. We love it." You know, and I mean, it required a great deal, like, Rob Wiedoff, he lives in Indiana, and he drove to Knoxville, which is like,
Mm.
I don't know, 6, 7-hour drive or something. And he had to drive back because he had to work on Friday.
Oh,
Like, he literally drove to
no.
Knoxville, hung out with our class, drove back to Indiana, and then the following day returned to Knoxville for the convention, right? So, like, he not only did he take the train, he drove for, like, more than 10 hours to do this.
Oh my
So
god.
that you know, Rob is just such a sweetheart. He's one of the really most
He's
genuine and
amazing.
kind and giving individuals I've pretty much ever met. So I'm very, very thankful to him and, to Rob. I mean, Roger booked his flight several days early, you know, like, he had to spend extra time in Knoxville. It's a cool town, there's lots to do
Yeah.
here, but, you know, like, that was really, really special. So I think it does communicate the very unique sort of love and respect and admiration that both of those guys and their colleagues on the cast, have for their fans. So I think you're right about that.
Yeah.
I'll share one other moment, from the class. I mean, there's
Yes,
so many
yeah.
great moments
Oh,
from
yeah, I know, but it's
one of
so
the most
hard, and we have
memorable
so
yeah,
much other stuff to talk about.
in the very first semester, right? Like, the very first semester, no one knew what this was gonna be like. I mean, I didn't even know until, like, a week before the class. I hadn't, like, finalized the syllabus, but I'll never forget the very first day of class, you know? There were about 65 students signed up for the class. So this little classroom is completely full at this point, And I wanted to make it a really powerful impression on them, like in the very first 5 minutes, that would communicate what the class was all about. So what I decided to do before I even introduced myself, before I said a single word in the class, I turned off the lights and I showed them a slideshow that I had made that was meant to give them a sort of emotional impression as to what the class would be about. And what I did in this like 4 minute slideshow is that I tried to replicate the loading screens of Red Dead Redemption 2. You know how they use these like really
Mhm.
cool stylized photographs from the
Yep.
kind of, 1899 moment, and then it has this kind of like bleed effect where it goes from one to you've watched hours and
Yes,
hours of this,
yes.
Tara, right? If you played so many hours as you claim to have played, which I believe,
Claim, how dare!
you know the loading screen. Everyone who's watching this knows those loading screens. So I tried to replicate that feeling, but not with fake photographs, but with real photographs from 1899. So on the
Mm,
Library of Congress's archive, there's an incredible collection of free open access to the
yeah.
public images that
Uh-oh.
megabytes each. So I made a slideshow with the bunch of images from that, and then of course in the background I played a song from the soundtrack of the game.
Yeah.
I think it's like the Outlaws theme, where it's like the kind of
Yeah.
spaghetti western theme. So
Mhm.
like as soon as the lights came back on and they'd watch that, they knew that their professor had indeed played and loved Red Dead Redemption 2, and that this was going to be a real class, right? Like we were not seeing Micah Bell, we were seeing, a church in New Orleans in
Mhm.
1898 or something like that. So that very brief slideshow, I feel like gave that this is a serious class, but your professor knows and loves Red Dead 2.
Yeah.
Right? That was what I wanted to get across. So that really kicked off the first day in a very successful way.
Okay. Well, I feel like I need to see this slideshow now. Like
Hmm. I can send it to you.
yeah, I wanna see it. Okay, so now we're getting into gonna get into all about the book. Um, as if we haven't already talked a ton about it already, but these are very specific questions. So to begin with,
Thank you for reading, by the way. Thank you so much,
oh
Tara.
my
It means
gosh.
a lot to me.
Listen, I even if I hadn't been I might have taken like one extra day to read it if I hadn't been, plowing through it after getting my copy at Comic-Con last weekend and knowing we were going to do this tonight. But it still wouldn't have taken me that much longer because
Yeah,
and to be fair, like as a history major, I've read some pretty dry texts. And even
this
even
is hopefully
after
not it.
even no, it's not at all, at all. But even after graduating college, I've still continued to read like biographies and historical, historical texts and everything that are probably like a little more meant for the public. Like I do love like Ghost Soldiers by Hampton Sides. It's a
Mm,
great World War II book. But anyway, so uh in Red Dead's history, you of course focus quite a bit on what the game got right or sort of right or well, not right at all. So I'm obviously curious what your overall thoughts are on how many of the game's accuracies or inaccuracies were on purpose. For instance, not wanting to give players the ability to make decisions around lynchings, uh, or needing and this is probably more my opinion than anything else, needing to set it in 1899 due to timeline issues that could or would have arisen otherwise, as they were including John and Dutch, who were
right.
in the first game, versus a lack of historical research on the part of the developers.
Yeah. Well, as I say in the book, and I do stand by it, despite all the things the game gets wrong or only half right, I think it does more to help rather than hurt historical understanding. Like I think it is a good thing for historical awareness in America that Red Dead Redemption 2 exists. Right? Even if there was no Red Dead's history book or anything, right? Like I think it's a force of good ultimately when we balance everything. Now, when it comes to the question of historical accuracy, Red Dead 2 and 1, they are able to very cleverly sort of circumnavigate that old accuracy question that people often have about video games that are historically based, because they fictionalize almost everything. right?
Mhm.
Just like Rockstar has done with the Grand Theft Auto game, right? Miami is not Miami; it's Vice City,
Yeah.
that sort of thing. So by
Thinly
this
veiled.
thinly veiled, but sometimes it's a little more difficult, like
Yeah.
what is New Hanover? What state
Yeah.
is that? I don't really know, it's a little slippery. New Austin, well, it's probably
It's
Texas, New
Texas,
Mexico, West
yeah.
Texas, something like that. But so they're able to kind of uh, walk the tightrope more effectively than, say, Assassin's Creed, which is much more explicit about using the names of real people and places and institutions.
Mhm.
The names of almost everything in the Red Dead games is fictionalized, right? Except for the Pinkertons. The Pinkertons are not fictionalized at all, which is kind of interesting.
Yeah.
Um, they were a real thing by that name. So they're able to walk around this in a way that makes it hard to criticize them.
Mhm.
I still do criticize the game in many ways. I kind of have to, as a historian. Um, but like I said, I think the game, as the scales tilt, it does more good than bad. But you're right, like the setting. One of the most consistent critiques that I have in the book is that Red Dead 2 is a pretty great game about the early 1870s,
Mhm.
but it's set in 1899, which is, doesn't make any sense for many of the topics, right? Like the Pinkertons are mainly busting up labor unions by 1899. They're not chasing many outlaws at that point. There are no bison left to hunt in the United States in 1899. Not none, but there's like literally 800 of them in the whole
Yeah.
country. So they're not like teeming on the Great Plains like they are pictured in the game. That would have made much more sense in the early 1870s. But I do think you're right, Tara, that one of the key reasons why they set it fairly close, 12 years from Red Dead 1, is they want to catch, John Marston when he's younger, Dutch when he's younger. So I get it from that storytelling perspective, but it really does break some of the the nuances of the
Yeah.
game in many ways. But and then other
From a
topics,
historical perspective anyway, not I
yeah,
mean, I'm sure, like, you and I see things that other people are, and I do not mean this, because this also sounds gatekeepy, and I'm like, "Oh, we're historians." I'm not, by the way. I got a history degree 20 years ago, and I have never once used that degree in my, like, professional career in terms of, like, actual, like, history, right? I have used things I learned while getting that degree, but
skills,
not the
yeah,
yes, but not the history. So
right.
I'm not trying to be
Until today.
yeah, but I'm not trying to be gatekeepy in any way, in that
No, but
respect.
a lot of
It's
people
just
who have neither a bachelor's or PhD in history care a lot about history and about
yeah,
historical representations. And a lot of fans of this game care a great deal. So you don't have to be, you don't have to have fancy letters behind your name
yeah,
to be a
exactly.
historical critic of this stuff. I think you're entirely right. And now there's two, there's the timing thing, like the 30 years off is one issue, but then there's other two huge silences in the game that are
Mhm.
also kind of understandable why they're not there. Like
Yes.
there's two topics that would have been unavoidable in actual America of 1899, but are completely absent. Not completely, almost completely absent in Red Dead Redemption 2. And one of them is party politics. Like, we live in a divided moment in American political history. So did people in 1899. Like so
Oh,
much
trust
so
me,
that
there was so much when I was reading this book. I was like, "Oh god, there's so many things I could say, and I'm just gonna not in this
yeah,
podcast, webcast, because I don't wanna get into
right. But
that stuff."
party
But
politics looked very different in 1899. There were some similarities. There was a lot of people fighting about immigration,
not
about
from now, not
restricting
from now. They look
borders.
different maybe from Red Dead, but they don't look different from now, just saying. Anyway,
Yeah,
sorry, I'm not
right.
trying to interrupt you.
No, 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 for
Anyway.
sure. But, so there's, like, no party politics in the
Yeah.
game, which, like, you might think, "Oh, well, outlaws, they wouldn't have voted, they wouldn't have political opinions." No, they definitely would have. Like, the
In real life, yeah.
voter turnout in the 1890s is much higher than it is today, proportionally based on
Mhm.
eligible voting population, and so it's very hard not to have a political identity in that period, especially Arthur, because, like, Arthur would have had a political identity in 1899. Because he's critical of racial hierarchy, right? Like he's pretty consistently anti-racist during the game, He's like, he does not accept, the sort of systems of white supremacy that existed at the time. That would have made him a political person just by definition, right? Like he would have had firm opinions that would have been not completely rare, but somewhat outside of the norm in many ways. And so
Yeah.
that would have made him political. And there is a great quote in Red Dead 2 when Arthur's like, "Why would anyone vote? Like, no, I'm not dumb enough to vote." No, he would have, he might even have tried to vote knowing that he might have gotten arrested doing so. So that's totally absent. The other big thing that's absent in the game that was massively dominant in shadowing almost everyone's life was the labor movement. It was the question of organized labor, of workers forming unions and organizing. Um, and that is gets one, as far as I've seen, one reference in the game, like one
Mhm.
line when Leviticus Cornwall is about to die. There's some mention of like unionization or labor movement, but that's it. However, like Rockstar's got to be careful when they talk about labor unions because they're a big corporation themselves, right? They don't want to throw rocks in a glass house, if you know what I'm saying. So I'm not going to comment at all on their labor politics or anything. I don't know that much about it, but
Yeah.
the absence of labor history in the game by a game made by a very large hierarchical corporation
Yeah.
is not that surprising either. That alone is, those are big absences, but I can understand why they're not there.
So, following up on that, the book delves into some US history, much of it the darker sort that was, if not misrepresented, then left out of RDR2, as you've already mentioned. If you could pick one inaccuracy and or thing that they didn't include that would have fit better with the 1899 timeline to be changed or added to the game, what would it be?
Yeah. I mean, the central argument of my book, if there is one, I think there kind of is one, has to do with violence, right? So Red Dead 2 is, of course, a very violent game, just like pretty much every Rockstar game and pretty much every popular video game period today. It's a very violent game. I read one gaming website that estimated that the minimum number of people killed in Red Dead 2 under an honorable playthrough, right, where you're not harming civilians, is like 900. So that is a staggering number of bodies.
Yeah.
Uh, I should note that only a handful of real historic outlaws even killed 10 people,
Yeah.
so like that is a bizarre exaggeration. Not surprising again, this is gamification of history, not the real representation. But the
Right.
thing that I really explore so heavily in the book is why did people shoot each other? Why did people knife each other or whatever? And in the game, most of the violence plays out not necessarily randomly, but because of personal factors, because of grudges, because of rivalries and maybe most importantly because of the personal pursuit of gain, right? Robberies,
Mhm.
right? Like sticking up a bank or a stagecoach or a train or whatever, that is the source of so many of the gunfights in the book. Now, the real America of the late 1800s was also violent, and certain pockets of it were really violent, much more so than today. But what ignited and what fueled that violence in real America was much less whiskey, poker, gunfight, robberies, and rivalries. It was big social and political questions, like the
Yeah.
big towering political and economic dilemmas of the day. That's what quickened people's trigger fingers at the time. And the book really foregrounds two dilemmas that were the most common to spur violence, whether it was in the West or in the South or in Appalachia. The first has to do with the place of corporate capitalism, of these big new businesses that were mainly headquartered on the Eastern Seaboard, about what kind of power they would have over regular people's lives. That was an incredibly divisive question at the time.
Yeah.
It was a very new question because many Americans had never seen companies this big before, right? Like the Union Pacific Railroad or the Swift meatpacking company. Like those were new institutions, and many people really hated them, and many people fight against them quite violently, right? So corporate capitalism is one dilemma that really fueled violence in the US at this time period. But the other one that really fuels a lot of it is this unfulfilled promise of racial equality. because with the end of the Civil War, the US really redraws the founding documents of the country to allow Black men primarily to also participate in democracy. It makes these huge promises after the Civil War, but then the US doesn't fulfill them, right? It doesn't fully
Mhm.
enact them. And that is going to be the source also of tremendous violence, especially in the South, but not exclusively in the South. And so in the book, I take violence seriously, right? Like I don't
Mhm.
pretend that the US was not violent. Instead, I use violence as a window to understand what these big social and political dilemmas were.
Yeah, and I will say, as from like a gaming perspective, and I to call myself a gamer, especially like the past couple years, would be like, meh, am I really? Like, I guess it depends on what your definition of gamer is. I've played a lot of games over the years, and some of them more like religiously than others, including this one. But from like a gamer's perspective, I think that like I mean, like you kind of already said, they obviously Arthur Morgan, if he was like a real life outlaw in the 1800s, whether it was the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s, whatever, he wouldn't have been killing 900 people. But this is also a game,
That's
and
I'm not too concerned about that. The
yeah,
numbers are like whatever. It's more like what's fueling the violence.
yes, yeah,
That is something that I think
yes.
is quite interesting and worth exploring.
Yeah, I think the Saint Denis stuff where they're up against the cops is probably more like realistic than most others. But um moving on a little bit, just because we're a little over an hour now and I want to try to get all these questions in. Which chapter of the book or comparison to the game was your favorite to write?
Hmm. Well, since you were just talking about Saint Denis and battles between outlaws and the police, I'm going to foreground my New Orleans chapter, which I really,
Mm.
really loved writing. So I zoom in on New Orleans right at that turn of the century moment when the game is set. And I take two moments that are really central to the game and try to shed light on what that actually looked like at the time. So the first are Sicilian immigrants, right? So anyone who's played the game knows Angelo Bronte, this kind of Sicilian mob boss that's running the city and all this. So I explored what was the actual were there Italian immigrants, Sicilian immigrants in New
Mhm.
Orleans at that exact moment? And the answer is yeah, there were a lot of them. Not just Italians, but 90% were Sicilians, which was unusually high within the United States. But the real story of Sicilians in New Orleans is not a story of them as victimizers of native born residents, the way that Angelo Bronte is, but very much as victims of it. So in this chapter, I discuss one of the most infamous mass lynchings in American history, which takes place in 1891, and in which 11 Sicilian immigrants are lynched by a native born white mob because they were suspected of having killed the police chief or being members of the mafia. There was no evidence linking them to that whatsoever. In fact, these guys had been
Mhm.
acquitted in a court and then were lynched after the trial. So if the game is set in 1899, this would have been like 8 years after this massive, horrific lynching. The lynching, by the way, leads to the creation of the first Columbus Day in 1892 that the US president declares like, hey, we got to have Columbus Day because Columbus Day was meant to acknowledge the contributions of Italians to America. And it was done in direct
Contributions. I'm
response.
sorry, what was that again?
Yeah,
Smallpox
exactly.
and
Well, yeah, I mean, it's so funny, there's so much criticism of Columbus Day in the last generation or so, but, the original motivation behind the holiday, sure, 400-year anniversary of Columbus coming, but it was very much triggered by what had gone down in New Orleans the previous year. Because
Yeah.
the Italian government is like, wait, you're lynching our citizens? Like, this is completely illegal and bizarre. So there's a lot of animosity between Italy and the US because of this episode in New Orleans in that very same decade, which is totally mind blowing to think about.
Yeah.
So that's one element of the chapter, and then I won't go into as much depth here, but because so much of the time in Red Dead 2 in Saint Denis is spent fighting these blue-coated police officers, right? Because there's no rival gang in Saint Denis. Everyone you're shooting basically are the police. I do explore a real shootout between an outlaw, quote unquote, and the New Orleans Police Department, not in 1899, but in 1900. In the summer of 1900, there is a tremendous bloodbath of a man, an outlaw. I mean, he's a criminal, he's a murderer, he kills. I think it's like 5 or 6 members of the New Orleans Police Department and multiple members of the crowds that were pursuing him. And there were literally gunfights that are even bigger than those of Red Dead 2. I mean, like one guy taking on a mob of
Yeah.
thousands, which is
Yeah, don't
totally
give
mind
away too
blowing.
many details because honestly,
You got to
like, that
read the
was
book to hear
yeah,
about it, right? But
yeah.
there was a real big shootout between an
It
outlaw.
was super interesting. I'd never heard of this before.
Yeah, Robert Charles is the name of the outlaw. But when you read it in the book, you'll find out that it's a very different story from Red Dead Redemption 2. But it is a shootout, to be sure.
I mean, I will say that one of the lines that stuck out to me, was this 10, and this is just one random sentence, right? A random in terms of there's
Oop, you just muted, Tara. Sorry, I can't hear you.
sorry, I think I hit the space bar with the corner of the book. Sorry. But one of the lines that stood out to me, and I'm not going to give any context because I don't think it really matters, but this tense intimacy of wealth and poverty lay at the heart of turn of the century New Orleans. And I wasn't going to bring it up, but since you said this was like your favorite chapter to write or whatever, I wanted to point out that I think that situation still exists, right? It's never changed, particularly in New Orleans. It is like, as somebody who is a huge lover of New Orleans and its culture, I have family that lives there. I have been there more times than I can count at this point. Uh, and particularly with everything that's happened in New Orleans in the past, at this point, 19-ish years, and of course before then too, but I feel like that is something that it's and I don't think you meant to portray like, oh, it hasn't, it's different now or whatever, but I think that's a very important thing to point out, is that tense intimacy between poverty and wealth is still a huge thing in New Orleans. And I'm not saying it isn't anywhere else, but I feel like it is very
It's
much
really
like,
pronounced there.
yes,
Yeah.
exactly.
I think Katrina, the hurricane, revealed that very
Yeah.
closely, to be sure.
Yep. Yep.
But yeah, I mean, in many ways, that's kind of a very all-American story.
Mhm.
Not that it's a good story, but it's
No.
very American. But it is so prominently on display in that city, right? I mean, that city
Yes.
is such a bundle of contradictions. It's such an amazing place, and it's such a horrifying place in many ways.
So, moving on, as a once student, like literal student, I feel like I'm still always a student because I have continued reading and whatnot.
I
I
feel the
still
same.
love watching, reading, and listening to podcasts and everything. But as a once literal student of history myself, and someone who has continued to enjoy consuming historical texts and whatnot, I loved that I still learned some new things when reading your book. And I assume that you also learned at least a few new things in the research you did for your class and or Red Dead's history. So I wanted to ask, what would you say was the most interesting or most amusing new thing that you learned?
Absolutely. There were so many moments, Western, Southern Appalachian history that I did not know coming in, that I did not know 3 years ago, like before teaching the class. So it's been such a joy to learn new stuff. I mean, that's like the most amazing experience, like learning does not end when you graduate. If it does, I feel bad for you. How about that? Like I think the key to longevity and happiness is to keep learning new stuff all the time. There's one moment that I only inserted into the book, like on the very last revision of it, and it still blows my mind. And it's a small detail. You might not think of it as, totally consequential, but to me it's very meaningful. So it's just one small detail from this very famous court case in 1896, Plessy versus Ferguson, right? This kind of infamous Supreme Court case that says that racial segregation is legal as long as facilities are equal, which they never were. But it's
Ha
basically,
ha ha,
kind of
yeah.
green lights the institution of Jim Crow, which would then remain in place for like 65 years more. And in the Supreme Court case, right, we had 9 justices, just like we do today. Back then, all of them were white men, not surprisingly. But it was not unanimous. There was one dissenter, and he was from Kentucky, and he was a former slaveholder. This guy who's formerly owned enslaved people from Kentucky, from a southern state, dissents to the rest of the judges, many of whom are not Southern, right? Most of them are who are Northern, city based people, and tells them this is absolutely against the definition of America. Like this is not a country founded upon hierarchies of race. It's totally goes against what this nation stands for. So we often I love that moment because this is like it's totally paradoxical. Like who would expect this guy? Well, he has a conversion during his life, and comes to see things very differently as a result of the Civil War and everything that happens after it. Harlan was his name, John Marshall Harlan, which is interesting. Harlan's a big Kentucky name, Harlan County, all this sort of thing.
Mm.
So John Marshall Harlan dissents, and it kind of shows up like sometimes we excuse too much of the past by saying, oh, people's mindsets were just different back then. Everyone believed that, all white people believed that racism was okay, so we can't hold people against that standard. No, there were people who did not believe it, and they didn't hide their feelings. Like they were vocal opponents of this. And so this was not passed unanimously, and that Harlan, of all people, is the one saying this cannot be the future is so interesting. So I did not know that until literally like a year ago. So that blew my mind.
I mean, it really speaks to the ideas of like educating a person and
People can
how
change.
yeah, how education and yeah, and the just general evolving of a person. I mean, I'll be honest, like I was raised in a very small farm town by a very conservative Baptist family. Weirdly enough, in Connecticut, asked me how that happened. I don't know
Oh
how
no, no,
Baptist
it's
like
part of Connecticut history too, to be
yeah,
sure.
well, I mean, Protestant, sure, but Baptist, that's way different. Trust me. Like, and I was one of very few people that I knew that was raised Baptist. Very, very few. Most of my friends were Methodist, Lutheran, or Catholic. But on, all of that said, like the way I was raised, I went to college, and it was like, those things don't necessarily stick with you as long as you have a a way to learn otherwise. And clearly this gentleman did. And I like that a lot. I like that there was that the one person who actually spoke against it was somebody who had actually been a former slaveholder. Is it's like it's important, I think.
It just
The
shows the complexity of the past, right?
yes.
Like there's not a simple black and white story of what happened.
Well, and I think
People
it's
have
the
nuance,
complexity of
right?
people, period.
Human
Yeah.
nature is we need to give it more credit than sometimes we do.
So I know that you had previously written academic texts, but while very educational, this book is obviously written for a much wider audience. And I am not saying that in any negative manner, right?
Oh no, I take it
I
in every positive manner. That's
yeah, like
exactly what I tried to do.
listen, I read this in 4 days, and I've read some other like historical texts that aren't meant to be academic, but still were slower than this. So just
So,
saying.
Tara, I'll just say the way that I was able to make that transition, because anyone who reads my first book, and I don't encourage you to do so necessarily, but anyone who reads the first book and then goes to this one is like, whoa, this is like a different guy who's written it.
Hmm.
What really changed me as a writer was the classroom, like was my teaching persona.
Mm.
Because I realized like, wait, I do know how to reach 21-year-olds. I do it every Tuesday and Thursday. Like I literally am speaking to these people and getting them excited about history. Why couldn't I do that on the page? So
Yeah.
in the book, you really hear my teaching voice, my teaching persona, right? There's shorter chapters, right? There's 20 chapters in this book. My first book had 6 chapters. It was way longer than this book, and it was 6 chapters. This one is 20 chapters. I use much more active verbs, not passive verbs. I use really colorful, adjectives and
Yes.
just rich description and lean
Yes.
into the storytelling side. Let the characters shine. I wanted to make this a fast-paced and engaging read. So the fact that you're able to tear through it in 2 or 3 days, that is the highest compliment that I could receive.
Well, I mean, to be fair, I'm again a very fast reader, but
Great.
that said, like the book interested me, intrigued me. I wanted to keep going because I wanted to see, okay, well, what's the opinion on the next thing? How are you going to take this next thing and turn it on its head, et cetera. But I mean, I was going to ask, like, do you feel that I and you've kind of half answered this because you think, or you said that your time as a teacher is what shaped how you wrote this book, but do you feel that you also grew as a writer through its
Oh,
creation?
so much. Yeah, I don't think I can write a book like my first book again. I don't think I really want to. I mean, like, I plan on writing more academic stuff for academic audiences, but I just don't wanna go back to that kinda, like, inside baseball
Yeah.
jargon that I still was kind of suffocated by in that book. I mean, I'm not saying that all academics should write like Red Dead's history. No, like that's
Yeah.
not the point. This book is based on so many scholarly monographs. Like you flip through the footnotes here, it is so dependent on much denser historical scholarship. But what I see as my job with this book is really being an ambassador, right? Like traveling outward from my discipline and trying to excite new people about the weird complexities of American history.
Mhm.
So I'm very much dependent on that kind of academic literature, but I don't know that I want to go back to writing it right away, at least. Check in with me in 10 years and I'll tell you where I'm at. But it's been very rewarding to write this book, and it's been rewarding to to engage with people who read your work. And I don't think all that many people read my first book, comparatively. So it's fun doing the other way too.
Okay, last thing about the book specifically, what is one thing you were not able to fit into Red Dead's history that you wish you could have and or hope to write about in the future?
Yeah. Well, I've already mentioned my regret that Guarma and
Mm,
the Caribbean and American imperialism is not part of the book. But I think the thing that really hurts more is Mexico and the Mexican Revolution, because I wrote a lot of lectures on that very topic. My original book proposal included 4 more chapters at the end about Red Dead One and the Mexican Revolution. But in the interest of space and in the interest of time and in the interest of keeping a sort of U.S. focus on it, I decided to cut those chapters. And maybe an expanded edition of this could come out in the future. I don't know if there's a market for that or not.
a
Um,
DLC.
yeah, exactly. A DLC for the book. I love that. I don't know. Yeah, so I have regrets about that, to be sure, because there's so many other topics that the games can help shed light on, and
Yeah,
I only get some of them. Like some other historian could write, and there actually has been other books about
yeah.
Red Dead Redemption and history. They haven't been as kind of publicly pitched in the way that mine has, but others have thought and written about this. So this is not like the final statement on this
Mhm.
topic. It's one of the first statements, but there'll be more to come, I'm sure, and I hope there is.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. Okay, so one one last thing before we get on to, like, some recommendations. In-person exploration. We, of course, met in Deadwood at the Black Hills Redemption event this summer, but have you visited any other locations that you think Rockstar might have used as inspiration or, practically copied in miniature, like New Orleans as Saint Denis? And, I guess, is the answer yes or no? I'm assuming it's yes.
No, the answer is no, actually. I mean,
Really?
Deadwood's really the first, kind of destination.
Okay, okay.
Yeah, I mean, I've been to New Orleans plenty of times, but it's been before I got into this project, so I haven't returned there. I know you have, Tara. I read your entire narrative about it. It was amazing. But no,
Well,
I've not traveled widely to try to see. Well, I shouldn't say that. The stuff that's set in Appalachia, it's not that I traveled there. I kind of live in it.
yeah, yeah.
Could go to Pigeon Forge, Tennessee, or to West Virginia and see some of the places that the game tries to evoke with the Roanoke Ridge, Butcher Creek sort of elements of the game. But
Mhm.
no, I haven't like gone on like Red Dead road trip. It would be fun, but I don't know if I could convince my 6 and 9-year-old daughters to come along because I have not let them watch Red Dead Redemption 2.
Well, I did see in your acknowledgments, I think it was, that, you haven't let them, like, play the game or watch too much
They
of you
watched
playing
a
the game,
little bit.
but that they call it the horsey game, and I just have to tell you that when I first started playing the first Red Dead Redemption, my now ex-husband and I, who I'm still best friends with, so this is not a
Yeah.
bad tale in any way, we call it horsey time, and we still, like, we were we'd been divorced like several years when the second game came out, and but we're still very good friends, and we're playing it. Sometimes he would like come visit me at my house and I'd be playing it, or I'd like let him play my game or whatever. And we've played Red Dead Online together, and we've just still continuously called it horsey time. So
Yeah.
I saw that and I was like, oh, horsey game, horsey time. It's like
I'll tell you
basically
a
the
funny
same.
story alongside that too. So when Roger and Rob came to visit me on campus back in March, I was not that annoying fan who asked them to make all these videos for my
Mm.
friends, but I did ask them for one video. I wanted them to make a video for my daughters, um, and I asked them to call it the horsey game in the video.
Oh, that's
So
great.
there's an amazing video on my computer of Roger and Rob being like, hey cowpoke, where are the guys from the horsey game?" So my daughters love that.
So, because you played the game after visiting New Orleans and you haven't been back to New Orleans since, did you have, like, some déjà vu of seeing Saint Denis? Like,
Oh,
did you
yeah.
recognize some of those places?
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, the docks on the river,
Yeah.
the streetcars, like St. Charles Avenue, all that. Oh, yeah, I've been there and done that. I mean, I'm really looking forward to going back. The dream that I've always had is that this, redemption gathering, first Tombstone, then in Deadwood,
Oh, you and
that
me
it
both.
goes to New Orleans because 'cause that'd be such an amazing place to host,
You
like,
and
a
me both.
gathering of
Yeah.
bands, and so I'm pushing for that, to be sure. It'd be
Yeah.
an incredible
No.
space.
I agree. So, because you haven't been to any other places other than Deadwood, what places would you like to visit other than New Orleans again, that likely or just straight up did
Mm,
inspire certain game locations? Do you have any?
yeah.
Or I'm a traveler, so I always like asking people these questions.
Yeah. Maybe like a plantation district in Cuba or like the Dominican Republic or something. I imagine
Yeah.
that was probably, the Guarma inspiration.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, I don't know. I mean, like, I'm not, in the book, I don't delve that deep into like what's the real life equivalent of like
Right.
Blackwater. Like, it didn't strike me as obvious, like St. Louis, maybe? I don't really know. Like to me,
So,
New Orleans, Saint Denis was so obvious, but some of like Valentine, that could have been
yeah,
so many different towns.
literally,
It's like
yeah.
a sort of like cattle boom town in the West. There were
Yeah.
so many places that could have stood in for it. I don't think there's one neat equivalent.
Well, I think like in the first game it's a little more obvious. Like Armadillo is surely oh my god, now I'm blanking on it.
You tell me, I do not know the answer.
Hold on. I like had it on the tip of my tongue, and then I real life counterpart. I had it on the tip of my tongue and then I lost it. But yeah, I think the first game Amarillo. Duh.
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah.
I mean, it
Yeah,
even looks like
correct.
if you look up old pictures of Amarillo, it's like
Hmm.
super freaking obvious, and plus the
Yeah, it's
name, let's be
interesting.
real.
Yeah,
And I think Tumbleweed was probably supposed to be closer to like Tombstone, Arizona. So it's I
right.
mean the map is very contained, and they're fitting a whole bunch of places. I mean, even the area that's supposed to resemble Appalachia, when you go farther north in it, that's not Appalachia. Those mountains are way too tall,
Yeah,
so
right.
but all right, well, last bit, recommendations. I am sure you have plenty of great recommendations for like academic text or whatever, probably as a
Just look through
history
the footnotes
teacher.
of my book,
Yeah,
basically, like,
exactly.
you can read all the greatest hits.
But I would love if you could to recommend, not you don't have to recommend all of them, but any or all of the following. One, do you have a historical nonfiction book that you've enjoyed that was written with a wider audience in mind, like yours was?
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. It's a little on the long side, but it's totally engaging. It's totally mind-blowing. I learned so much reading it. It's called Buffalo Bill's America by Lewis Warren,
Okay.
and it is a biography of Buffalo Bill, Buffalo Bill William Cody, who does more than any single figure to popularize this idea of a Wild West. I mean, some people claim he even invents the phrase. He had his Wild West show. He was probably the most famous person in the world in the 1890s or so.
Mhm.
But his life is filled with complete paradoxes. Like he defies every stereotype you would imagine. He just has such an insane life that it's worth like a 500-page biography. So Buffalo Bill's America is just like, if you're a Wild West, obsessive, read this book and you will never think about the Wild West the same ever again.
Okay, well, I'm gonna add that to my list.
Yeah.
Do you have a movie and or TV series that's based on historical events that doesn't sacrifice a ton of accuracy while still being like riveting would be great, but I'll settle
Yeah.
for a good watch if need
Right.
be.
I mean, I think a lot of American historians on the question of on this question for kind of like the late 19th century would probably go with Deadwood. Deadwood is,
Mhm.
I mean, HBO is very good at doing this kind of thing. Deadwood is the excellent kind of rural Western counterpart, and then I do like, for a newer show, The Gilded Age on HBO as well, which
Yes.
is great. I mean,
I was
it's
wondering if you would like it or not because I was thinking about like
yeah,
mentioning it
it's
and I was like,
too
ooh.
I wish it wasn't so much about the social politics of rich people in New York. Like they're like the great divide is between the old rich and the new rich. I'm like, no, that's not the great divide of America. That's between the rich and the poor. Who are there. But I mean, it's a good show. I really enjoy watching it. I do have like a couple of friends who are also historians of the Gilded Age and Progressive Era, and we've chatted about it a decent bit. And it's not perfect, but the second season is better than the first, actually. The second season diversifies the cast more in terms of class and background and race. There's some really
Mhm.
great, interesting, great episodes in the South that explore kind of African American history in that age of Booker T. Washington, who's such a
Yes.
towering figure then. So I like the Gilded Age. So I
Yeah,
like
no,
Carrie
I
Coon
agree.
a lot too. She's really awesome. Who plays the matriarch of the nouveau riche family. She's amazing.
Yeah, I've very much enjoyed Gilded Age. I mean, and also it's basically Downton Abbey. Sorry,
It's the same director, isn't it?
Downton.
Or same,
Yeah, it's the
yeah,
same. It's Downton
the American
Abbey,
version,
but the American version. Yeah,
right?
I mean,
Yeah,
also set quite a bit earlier. But
right.
okay, one other piece of media: a book, a podcast, a movie, a series that doesn't fit into either of the above categories, but that you just love, like just something you've been super into in the
Yeah.
past or recently.
I'll tell you the best historical fiction book that I've read in the last few years.
Okay.
And it's not going to be shocking. It's like a very popular book, but as a historian, I think it's really good, which is All the Light We Cannot See, which is
Okay.
set in World War II, Europe,
Mhm.
France, and Germany mainly.
Yep.
Such an amazing book. I mean, I guess there's a Netflix series on it now, but
Yes.
I haven't seen it yet, but I love that book. Oh my gosh, it was really emotionally powerful. And me and the 900,000 other people who read it. It can't be wrong, right?
I
It's not
haven't
set in the
I
19th
haven't
century,
read
but
it. I haven't read
oh,
it.
you really should.
I
I
watched the
love the
Netflix
author.
series. I watched the Netflix series. It's one of those books that is like, "Oh, it was on my list," but then the series came out and Dean, he doesn't read a ton of, like, historical fiction, so I was like, "Oh, let's just watch
Mm.
this," and I do have
Was
it,
the
like,
show
on my
good? Did you
list.
like it?
I thought it was good, yeah.
Yeah, the book is, like,
I don't know how
unbelievably
accurate it
good.
was to the book, but it was good.
Yeah, it's good.
Um, okay, so I'm gonna real quick give 2 recommendations myself. I was actually gonna give 3, but you already recommended The Gilded Age, which that was gonna be my, like, wild card
Yeah.
recommendation, and it didn't and now it doesn't have to be a wild card, yay. I'm gonna give 2 recommendations myself based on if you like Red Dead's history and felt yourself nodding along, particularly with your writings about post-Civil War Black history and your thoughts on the depictions of Appalachia. Um, the first is a nonfiction book. It's called Medical Apartheid: The Dark History
Mm.
of Medical Experimentation on Black Americans from Colonial Times to the Present by Harry A. Washington. Other than the title, I can't like I don't I have nothing else to say other than it is a I don't want to say it's an easy read because it's not an easy read because it's some dark ass shit. I would say, excuse my language, but I swear a lot on my podcast. So it's some dark ass
We've had
shit.
a very tame session here, haven't we?
Yes, for me, yes.
Given
But
all the violence that we're talking about.
it is a very, very, very good book.
Yeah.
It was required reading actually by my job.
Mm.
But I mean, even if they had just told me like, hey, here's this book, you should check it out, I would have anyway. And it is really it's historical. in that it goes, like I said, back to colonial times, but it's very good, and it's written for the masses, I guess I would say, if in terms of like it's not like a super academic
Yeah,
dry text. So
right,
it's very good.
right.
Have you read it before?
I haven't, but I've heard of it for sure.
It's really good. I would
I've read
highly suggest.
similar, like, kindred books in that
Yeah.
field. Yeah.
The other one is a fiction book. It's called Demon Copperhead by Barbara Kingsolver. Have you read that one?
My wife's
No.
read it. It's, like, probably on the shelf behind me. I
Yeah.
just haven't had the time to do it. It obviously was, like, the book of the year for almost everyone last year, and I know
So
it's about Appalachia. Part of it takes place in
yeah.
Knoxville, where I live, so
I
I'm looking
hadn't
forward to reading it.
yeah, I hadn't I used to love Barbara Kingsolver. My one of my favorite books of all time is one of her books. Oh my god, Poisonwood Bible was one of my
Mhm.
favorite books of all time. It's very dark. It's like missionaries in
I know the
Africa,
premise. I have
and it like does justice to the fact that, ooh, why are you doing this, guys? Why you
yeah.
like this, guys? Um, but yeah, Demon Copperhead. It's a heart wrenching but at times still uplifting look at the life of a young boy growing up in Appalachia, southwestern Virginia, to be specific, is where most of the book takes place. It is set in more modern times, like the 1990s through like maybe the early 2000s. But it has some really great insight into how so many in the US still to this day have the opinion that, to sort of quote your book, the mockery of poor rural whites, especially from the Southern mountains, is like totally okay. So,
our current vice presidential nominee for the Republican Party has made his career on that very topic. So
yeah.
these are not topics of no significance. They matter. I think I haven't read Kingsolver's book, but my gut sense is that it gives a much better vision of Appalachia, what makes it tick, than old JD Vance does. Though I also have 3 chapters on Appalachia in
Yes.
here where I delve into
Well,
many of those same
right,
questions.
and to be honest, that's why I wanted to suggest Demon Copperhead, because it's like
Yeah.
if you read Red Dead's history and you have any interest in further exploring, um, I don't I mean, yes, it's history of Appalachia, but it's more recent history, but they
Yeah.
do in Demon Copperhead, uh there is some text about like the coal mines and everything and how that affected their whole region, and also the sort of the common situation where like, oh well, so much of our subsistence comes from, even in the late 1900s, comes from hunting and fishing and stuff. It's just it's a really good book, and it had been a long time since I had read a Kingsolver book, and I like could not put it down. Like, I'm pretty sure Dean was mad at me at some
It's like
points because I was like, I
next
was
on my
reading
list.
and he was like, let's watch stuff. And I was like, no, I'm reading. Stop. Or just put something on and I'm ADHD, so I can watch and read at the same time. Okay.
Mm.
So, all right. Well, any other things? Well, yeah. Any other things you want to note before we close out?
I'm really eager to play Red Dead Redemption 3.
Oh my God, you and me both. Whenever it possibly, maybe, who knows, exists.
That might require a second edition of Red Dead's history.
A change.org petition.
Yeah, exactly. It'll come. I'm sure it will, you know?
At this point, I'd be happy with like a DLC of
That ain't gonna happen.
Sadie and Charles bounty hunting in
Yeah.
South America.
I think 5 years after release date, that window has likely closed.
Yeah, I know. Listen, let me have my educated wishes, as Deadpool would say.
Yeah. Well, it's really fun. What the you might remember this in the book, in the epilogue, the very last chunk of it, I actually give my
Mhm.
vision for what Red Dead 3 should look like. I'm sure it will have no bearing on what actually it looks like. But I would like to see the game actually go to the early 1870s, where Red Dead
Mm,
2 kind of wanted to be from the beginning, and explore things like Reconstruction, the warfare between native peoples and the government that's really, at high tide at that moment. But it's just such a wild, quote unquote, moment in American history that
yeah.
I'd love to see the game engage it. And you go even further with the great historical work they did on the second game, and go even further in the third.
Yeah.
So we'll see. Maybe in a couple of years, or maybe a
Uh,
couple of years.
I was gonna say it was like what 8 years between Red Dead 1 and Red Dead 2, and they're
Well, that's good. That means
currently
we only
deep.
got 3 years to go.
Yeah, well, yeah, but they're currently deep into GTA
Of
6,
course.
and yeah, they're not gonna start working on anything else till that comes out, which worries me, but you
No,
know.
probably not.
All right, as we close out the episode, just want to give a shout out to our heroes to your patron, Tommy of the TKOK Podcast Network. Thank you so much for supporting us. And thank you for joining myself and a special guest, Tori Olsson, for this interview and discussion born from our shared passions for history and Red Dead. Do not forget to follow Tori at Red Dead History on Instagram, and to, of course, place your book or audiobook order for Red Dead's history via any major bookseller or audiobook app. For the most current news and updates about this series, as in the Geek Saga series, not the Red Dead series. I realized, like, after the fact, I was like, wait a minute, that sounds wrong. For the most current news and updates about the Geek Saga Show / Geek Saga podcast, make sure to follow at a Geek Saga on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok, Threads, Twitter. But also please consider backing our Patreon at patreon.com/Geek Saga _entertainment.
Donate to Tara.
Yeah, please.
Geek Saga is amazing, and I'm so grateful to be
Fund,
on the show.
fund, fund my podcasting. All right. Bye, guys.